is Larry Bauer, Chief Executive Officer of the Family Medicine Education Consortium. And we're joined tonight by Dave Chase, who is author of numerous books and has been behind the Health Rosetta revolution, as I think of it. I first met Dave back in 2013. He came to our first DPC National Summit. He had known, or Erica Bliss, who was on our planning group, knew about Dave. Dave was kind enough to come on his own dime because he believed in direct primary care. He gave an awesome plenary speech that I won't forget. And now we're going to be hearing from him. He wrote a book called Relocalizing Healthcare. And I think most of the folks on the call here have had a chance to read that. So Dave, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. That's amazing. That was 8 years ago. I think it was in the summer, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I think that was the year that I published the seminal paper on direct primary care with the California Healthcare Foundation, and started writing about direct primary care June 4th. Wow. I think June 4th, 2010. So I guess we're just about 11 years from that. But I was happy to get the call from Larry to kind of catch you up on the thinking, and we kind of bounced around some different ideas. So what hopefully you're seeing on your screen is a presentation I'm going to go through that will start kind of hopefully inspirational and kind of where we're at. But then kind of get into some brass tacks. There's a lot that's been developed. And even since then, I started the Health Rosetta organization, had a different company back then that WebMD had acquired. And this is really now my calling and kind of my life's work. And I'll get into the second half, kind of brass tacks. Okay, great. Got this hopefully inspirational view. How do we actually make it happen? Because it's not like people don't know that we have a broken system. So the way I'd start is, I believe, in my mind, there's no doubt that we're in the biggest inflection point, certainly in my lifetime. I think every community coming out of COVID is going to make an explicit decision to go forward and improve things, or as a result of COVID is damaged and has gotten worse. And the kind of pivotal fork in the road in my mind is these two dates I'm going to talk about. I don't know if you remember March 9th, 2016. I don't know if you remember what was going on back then, but that was a real crystallizing moment for me. You may recall there was a presidential race going on. And that was the morning that I woke up and Bernie and Trump had won the Michigan primary. And I was like, no, that's not a standard thing. What's going on here? And you started hearing terms like populism. I'm like, okay, what exactly is populism? And I looked that up and looked up, when does that rise? Well, populism tends to rise when there's economic depressions. Okay, well, what's exactly is economic depression? Well, there's a few definitions, but one of them is 2 or more years of wage stagnation or decline. And that really hit me between the eyes, because I realized at that point, the working and middle class in America had been in an economic depression over 20 years by that definition, entirely due to healthcare. And, that's more than twice as long as the Great Depression. That's longer than 1930s Germany. And unfortunately, I think that was quite predictive of the sort of polarization and angst that was going to happen. And you look at the status quo healthcare system, and the first chapter in the first book I solely wrote was entitled, We've Gone to War for Less Than What Healthcare has Done to America. And you look at this weird situation that we have that healthcare is actually not expensive. Clinicians are only getting 27 cents of every dollar ostensibly spending on healthcare. What's expensive is profiteering, price gouging, administrative bloat, fraud, and inappropriate treatment. And unfortunately, we're this, what I'd call a $1 trillion tax that we didn't vote on, that was levied on us by Wall Street. That $1 trillion of waste, which is probably conservative now, I mean, that would be the 15th biggest economy in the world. And we're just basically kind of pouring it away and getting very mediocre outcomes in the process. And as you all know, we've managed to do that, produce mediocre outcomes and record levels of burnout and suicide amongst doctors and nurses. And this was pre-COVID. To me, this is what I'd call, this misspelled health. I mean, it's hell on earth in what we're doing. And, what I'd invite you to do is fast forward. Let's imagine a future together where every community, whether it's an employer community, kind of a micro community, or a place-based community, can focus on building what I'd call wealth, again, misspelled wealth, really focused in on well-being. People have not only great healthcare, but things like a good, well-paying job, educational opportunities, the opportunity to live in a decent home in a safe neighborhood. And, these are the things that drive 80% of health outcomes that essentially healthcare is essentially stolen away from. But here's the good news. We don't actually have to imagine this future. You can see it with your own eyes, from Florida to Alaska. And you would be very hard pressed to find two communities that I'm going to go through, these two examples, that had more challenges that they were facing. But they had forward-looking community members that said enough is enough. And they didn't have any special credentials. They just wanted to make something happen in their community and realized, the cavalry's not coming from DC. We've had both parties in full control. It's really on us. And this was, they had will, and they really had a love for their community, and they could endure the inevitable challenges any time you tackle a meaningful problem like this. So let's start with kind of the big picture. I think the common thread in these two stories that I'm going to share is they essentially reasserted sovereignty over health in their community. And they put the community's well-being as their primary goal, not perverse Wall Street incentives. Essentially, these Wall Street-driven incentives, which result in rational actions against a set of irrational goals, they're essentially have colonized our communities, extracting valuable resources with devastating consequences. If you look at a county like the one I live in, with about 250,000 people, so all ages, all in, we spend a little over $2.5 billion on healthcare. Conservatively, at least $1 billion is extracted out of our local community for a fundamentally local service. I mean, what's more local than interaction between a patient and doc, after all? And we've done this while health outcomes have worsened and took away resilience at multiple levels for a situation like we've been in with COVID. So let's go through a couple examples. And I want to start in Florida. Some of you may be familiar with the Rosen story. And, I'd really, highlight this as a great example of they've cumulatively saved $460 million benchmarked against their peers. And then they put that back into their community and their business. Rosen Hotels as an employer was the only major hotel to stay open throughout COVID. Of course, they took a hit like everybody. And they did amazing things for their employees. And that was a lot of what my TED Talk was about. I'm going to focus more on the community impact. The Tangelo Park program. They said, let's invest in kids in education. And this is essentially the inspiration behind the purpose of our organization and the social impact metric for Health Rosetta, which is basically premised on this notion that I mentioned earlier. We're already investing more than enough money to not only fund a world-class healthcare system, but to fund or restore funding to what drives 80% of health outcomes. And in Mr. Rosen's case, he took 5% of that Health Rosetta dividend and put it back into kids and education. Others are wasting and squandering money. They did right by their community in the form of things like, well, before I get into that, this was a very challenged community. This is where if you wanted drugs when you were, a tourist visiting Orlando, this is where you'd go. In fact, you might go to the elementary school where we're going to talk about. In fact, the principal would show up early every day to pick up needles out of the playground so kids wouldn't get hurt by them. And what they did, sorry, my screen's acting a little wonky, was essentially looked at the challenge ahead of them, right? In the form of, with their income, only 9% of kids would be predicted to have college achievement. We know how big that is in terms of well-being versus a top income quartile would have 77%. But they didn't want to accept that fate. They wanted right by their community. And so that was where, they did this partnership with Mr. Rosen, took 5% of that Health Rosetta dividend and put it into educational programs, college scholarships, family support. Not rocket science stuff, but stuff that, takes a long-term investment. And so today, the kids coming into school are really school ready. And you can see that in terms of what the outcomes are in their community. And so, again, you look at, I'm sorry, we have a little wonkiness with the screen here. So you look at what their graduation rates are, they're higher than the highest income quartile communities today in terms of college achievement, 8x improvement, pretty remarkable. And you look at what that means in terms of the return on investment. It's a 7-to-1 return on investment to society for that investment. Again, pretty remarkable scenario. And they are, they're replicating that to a neighborhood 5 times that size. And then some other communities are saying, let's do the same thing. And I'd say, why not in your community? I'm quite sure your community isn't more challenged than what Tangelo Park was, or the community we're going to talk about in a moment, which is the Alaska Native community, where as opposed to a business leader driving, this was really community driven. And I think one of the things that's important is this quote from one of their board members, because you could use this story as kind of an argument for or against single payer, but it would kind of miss the point. It was actually who cared versus who paid. At the end of the day, we all pay. It just comes through different forms. And so they really, took the bull by the horns, and, you looked at what sort of challenge they had. I'm sorry about that. I don't know why this isn't, hang on a second. Okay, here we go. This is a picture from their facility before the South Central Foundation took over. And, you could see that it was not a great place. And they just, the South Central Foundation, which is Alaska Native community, took over responsibility and did, they started out with a 4-month listening tour, talked to everybody in the community. What did they want? And it was a complete reset. They didn't just tweak what they had, and they combined, community values with the best of modern medicine, and really shifted this mindset of no longer patients, they're customer owners. And they adopted what I'd call a no excuses model to healthcare. Unfortunately, one of the things I hear a lot are people making excuses. And I'm not saying there aren't real challenges in every community, but they had extreme challenges, and they just said, we're going to deal with it. Communities with not one medical professional, where in the winter the only way to get there is a sled, check, they have that difficulty. You could check all the difficult boxes, but they just accepted and understood what was reality and said, we're going to do something about it. And the results are stunning. I mean, they went from having some of the worst health outcomes in the entire world, certainly in the US, to what many consider the best healthcare system in the world. I mean, people from Singapore to Sweden come and visit their situation there. It's really, really remarkable. And you look at it, spills over into, job opportunities, educational achievement. When they took over, there was literally one Alaska Native in their healthcare system. Now over half of their staff are Alaska Native. So they've created opportunities for them. And the key thing is it's unpacking what local control means. This is not about having a local board or local governing authority that ultimately answers to a higher authority. There's those situations where a stroke of a pen, somebody from afar can close a hospital or change something. That is not local control. They really assume that. And the ownership is not just also the clinicians, it's also the people who would seek care, which I think is also important in this. Obviously, the clinicians matter a lot, docs matter a lot, but so does the community. And so I think it's just a great example where we're already investing enough money to expect a world-class healthcare and be able to take that money that's basically just going to Wall Street today through the folks who carry their water, the big, mega carriers, the big PBMs, big health systems, and say, let's repatriate that money. And again, our metric is this Health Rosetta dividend, and it's dollars and cents. And I have a few examples here. These are case studies you can find in my book from, school districts to individual employers, some incredible stories. I could talk, 10 minutes easily about each one of those. And the health outcomes are much better. If you could put this approach into a pill and you look at the health outcomes, it would be the blockbuster drug of the century.
Getting my charts done. I'm on a.
Okay. Guess he knows to go to mute. I was like, oh, I'm doing something wrong here. And so what I've really been doing for the last decade or so is essentially to torture the Rosetta Stone metaphor a little bit. I've just been on a dig, this kind of scavenger hunt on what works and how do you do this. And this is what, we've learned a lot, and we've seen it work in every corner of the country. Small, rural communities, urban communities, small employers, large employers, public sector, private sector organizations. We haven't found a place this hasn't worked. And I believe this inflection point we're at, as we exit COVID, I believe it is sort of like a World War II type of thing, where there's a pre-World War II world and a post-World War II world. Same with COVID. And then you couple this with millennials, the largest generation in history. Sorry, boomers, you've been surpassed. They're already the largest chunk of the workforce. The oldest millennials are now in their early 40s, right? They've left the invincible stage of life. They're increasingly in decision-making roles in elected office. Many of them have their own health issues. And plenty of them are increasingly caring for elderly parents. And does anybody think that anything about the status quo healthcare system is remotely optimized for what millennials want and value? And frankly, I think what all of us want and value. If you look at, who's led so-called big food and big soda to have some of their worst earnings the last few years, who drove adoption of smartphones, social media, these types of things. They really drove that. I think this is really being underestimated. Again, today they're the largest chunk of the workforce. 5 years, millennials, post-millennials are expected to be 75% of the workforce. And I talk about the workforce because that's, even though very little about Health Rosetta is employer specific or frankly even US specific, it is an area where you can do permissionless innovation. And that's a really difficult thing to do in healthcare. And, about half of Americans get their healthcare that way. And, it's probably 2/3, 3/4 of industry profit. So if you want to impact healthcare, it's actually a pretty good place. And what we've seen work, you don't have to do these things in this order, but it spells out this acrostic that I'm going to go through. And it's important to note, as people are concerned about change and disruption and all these types of things, 4 of the 5 steps are invisible to the member in the health plan or only a positive. So think about that as we go through. It's only the last one could definitely be a positive, but if you don't do it right, it can have issues. So let's kind of step through that. The old model of let's work on a new plan for years and years and years, and there's this big bang theory, we'll get this benefit. I just don't think that has proven to work. We tend to think of more of a step stair. And the first one is just mindset shift. Nothing happens without mindset shift. You look at some of the logos here, these are case studies in my book on the site. These are organizations that have far superior benefits, and they're spending 20 to 55% less per capita. And so it's just a mindset shift, right? A lot of people think fixing healthcare is like trying to fix Middle East peace. Like they like that fix too, but it seems kind of hopeless and out of their control. So if they believe that, they're right. If they don't, they can do the things that these organizations have done. And so, there's a little benefit you realize making that first step. The next step, this is really boring stuff, but it's kind of the master key that unlocks the other doors. We see this get overlooked, and some of the later steps, even when you have a willing buyer and seller between, say, a purchaser of healthcare and a provider of healthcare, they're blocked contractually. This is incredibly important piece of it. And it's also things like who you go to for architecting your plan and what are their interests. One of the co-founders with me of Health Rosetta was a former securities attorney. He worked for the guy who represented Ken Lay and the Enron guys. He worked on huge fraud cases, some of the bad actors on Wall Street. He saw their Bloomberg terminals, and he came in here relatively new, about 5 years. And he's like, oh my, a small fraction of what is standard operating procedure in health plan and health plan administration and selling would get you thrown in jail in healthcare. That's how off the rails it is. So this is one of these things that's very easy to overlook. We've done a lot of digging, and there is some savings to be had here because there's so much junk in here. Like Copper State is a 1,000-person manufacturer in the Southwest. They didn't do any of the other things I'm going to talk about. They got rid of junk fees. They aligned things with their advisor. They actually watched claims. They got $1,000 per employee per year of savings. That was $1 million for them without changing anything else. That's how off the rails things can be. So there's some benefit there. But again, it's kind of the master key that unlocks the door. The next thing is carving out PBM. A lot of people haven't heard of what PBMs are, pharmacy benefit managers. Do you know there's not one pure pharma company in the Fortune 50? Only J&J is in the Fortune 50, but they're not a pure pharma company. There's 3. The 3 big PBMs are Fortune 50 companies. One of the big 3, known as a big retailer, they had 185 billion in revenue, and you'd think that was mostly from retail. 120 billion of that was from their PBM business. That's how big a business. In a lot of drugs, PBMs are making more money than pharma. So the good news is there's a lot of shenanigans here. They've created up to 30 revenue streams for themselves. You get rid of that garbage, you can save a lot of money. And that's the type of thing that you can do quickly. You don't have to, there's opportunities to change where people get their medications and formulary, but even without doing that, you can get a lot of savings. State of New Jersey, for their employee health plan, they saved $1.6 billion in their first 3 years. Pacific Steel and Recycling, I mentioned later, about a quarter of their savings, I can talk about later, came from their pharmacy spend. So put a little pin in that. Caterpillar, really the only thing they've done, and they've done it to a pretty extreme degree, was tackle pharmacy benefits. and they haven't seen overall healthcare spending go up in a decade. That's how much fat there is in this system if you procure drugs correctly. The profiteering is unreal here. So very significant savings. Guess what? That can provide the funding for what we all know and love, right? Which is add value-based primary care. It's also something where there's direct savings, but it's also kind of a master key that unlocks other savings. You know, we know that half of ER visits are not an emergency. Lots of surgeries are inappropriate, unnecessary. You can't surprise bill, you can't balance bill, you can't price gouge on a surgery ER visit that never happened. And that's where you see some immediate savings. You look at some of the longest term organizations like the Rosens, like the Gasparilla Inn, some of these others, the pipe trades in Minnesota. Again, one that just about the only thing they've done is primary care for their 16,000 members, even though they only have 25% of their members in so far, because it's a 99% male membership and women make most of the household decision. Despite only doing primary care, only getting 25% of their members in, they haven't seen overall healthcare spending go up in a decade. Tells you what the opportunity is here. They've done a really nice job. To me, fully actualized primary care, and which you see in a place like Rosen, you see in places like Denmark. 90% of the issues people come into the healthcare system for can be fully addressed in these fully actualized primary care. Includes behavioral health, includes PT, things like that. Probably not news to any of you here. So again, tremendous opportunity here, additional savings that then can get invested back, into people and the rest of the system. The final step is one members will definitely notice. And if you don't do it right, it can have blowback. You can have a bad member experience. You definitely have to be thoughtful here, but it's where the biggest savings is. So it's leave behind these value extracting networks. Essentially when you're an employer, you rent these networks from these monster carriers, and that gives you the privilege of wildly overpaying. When you look at a Pacific Steel, that 5 years ago, they were spending over $8 million on health benefits for their 700 plus employees and dependents. Last year was a bad year. They had multiple cancers. They had a serious heart condition that led to somebody dying. And their spending went up to $3.6 million. It had been down below $3.5 million. Had they been on the mythical medical trend, they should have spent last year $9.4 million if they'd done what other people were doing. How did they do that? I mentioned 25% of it was the pharmacy. The other 3/4 is over a 2 to 3 year period. They put in 5,500 direct contracts. They're not some huge organization. They're spread 9 states, 40 locations. You can't do 5,500 direct contracts unless these contracts are incredibly fair and simple, which is what they did. That's what allowed them to do that. What did that mean? For the business, what that meant was the equivalent of, for a low margin, slow growth manufacturer, I talked to their CFO. We've had some webinars with him. They would have had to increase top line revenue for their company of $40 to $50 million for a $200 million a year revenue company, give or take. That's pretty tough. The best part, they happen to be an employee stock owned company. So I'm sworn to secrecy on the specific, but there was a forklift driver who walked out with a nest egg that was probably 25 to 30 times larger than the average American, because not just the health benefits, but it more than doubled his nest egg, because a company that takes nearly 5 million to the bottom line is a more valuable company, an employee stock owned company. Your nest egg is your share of the company. That's what's possible. How many forklift drivers making $45,000 a year are walking out with a 7-figure nest egg, right? That's what's possible when we don't squander healthcare. In fact, you look at that 7-figure nest egg, it's actually a pretty good thing. If you look at the youngest boomers who've been working 30 plus years, had healthcare inflation grown at the rate of regular inflation versus medical inflation, if you invested that spread between the two, that's basically been squandered in the form of profiteering, price gouging, administrative bloat, and fraud, and just put it into S&P index fund, the average boomer would have $1 million nest egg. How many have that? That's the impact of this. And so very significant impact. There's some who rip off the Band-Aid and do all this stuff right away. Most will take the step stair approach, which is what we like to see. So I go into this in the book that's there. Sounds like some of you have already read it, which is great. Actually, if you go to our site now, there's an executive summary, both in text and audio of it, if you want to share it with people. We make it available for free. We don't have any obstacles there. So with that, I will stop my screen share and look forward to getting any questions. The tougher, the better. And please don't pull any punches. So hopefully that came across so clear, and sorry for the screen wonkiness a few times, but hopefully got through that.
Hey, thank you very much for that. And I will turn it over to the group and reactions, questions. Joe?
Hi, Dave. Joe Scherger. Thanks for that. I'm having a deja vu experience. I went to Sharp Healthcare in San Diego in 1992 to be the vice president of primary care. And what was happening was it was the beginning of the managed care revolution. And they realized that there was billions of dollars to be saved by basically utilization management and taking a careful look at how we were spending money and negotiating contracts. And indeed, one of the health plans that formed was making so much money with what they were saving that they actually had to hire psychologists to do stress management to the executives because they didn't know what to do with all the wealth. I mean, that's really the robber barons that came in, but everyone else. And then it all imploded, as the business people got wise and caught up to it. I hope we don't make those 1990s mistakes again as we move into this cost savings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot to be learned from that, and there were some good aspects to some of that. One of the things that I don't think was good was a common approach was, primary care as gatekeeper. I think the best model is primary care as a gateway, not a gatekeeper. The other thing was, that wealth was able to be extracted out of that community. And we know that just within the healthcare system, we're very siloed, right? And that's a problem, and particularly as we've destroyed primary care in this country. It's not good that, people are collecting specialists like they, collect socks or something. And that's an issue, no doubt. But we also silo totality of health. And so if you look at whether it's the NUCA model in South Central Alaska or a Jönköping, Sweden model, this is why, these community-owned health plans is, to me, the key here is then that dividend can stay in that community, right? And so whether it's in Alaska or Sweden, they can say, oh, medically, somebody's primary diagnosis may be diabetes, but actually the real primary diagnosis is loneliness or dependence. And how about we, for maybe seniors, how about we address that? Programming or community connectivity. There's a number of these issues. If you go upstream enough, which generally primary care goes upstream some, but a lot of the upstream has to go further upstream to societal things. And they're not always quick fix things. That's where, you look at a Rosen, I mean, that didn't all pan out in 3 years. It took a while. He was committed. And that's where, when you have that governance at a local level and the savings can stay at the local level, then a community can decide, okay, we've got this dividend. Do we want to put it into early childhood education, or do we want to put it into mental health services, or do we want to do something on the public health front? To me, that is how it can be different. And really, the system change model that I talk about in chapter 1 of the Relocalizing Health, the essence of it is find what works, and then figure out how to tease out what are the key business elements of that. How do you maybe apply a little bit of technology, perhaps some capital to massively replicate? A lot of the funding in healthcare is very much a venture capital mindset. Nothing wrong with venture capital for certain types of businesses, but generally venture prays at the altar of scalability. And I believe the key here is replicability. And that's actually quite different. What a community in West Virginia may want and need is quite different than what may be needed in Vermont or Wyoming. And so that's the type of thing that why I'm really evangelizing. That's what's working, whether it's in the Basque region of Spain, Sweden, Florida, Alaska. I just call that community-owned health plans, because the governance is at a local level and the savings stay at that local level.
So, Dave, this is the other Joe on the line. Sorry for jumping. Something I've always wondered about, and I'm prone, I guess, to almost conspiracy thinking about, is why did the healthcare co-ops, the cooperative insurance movement, just die out on the vine? Because it seems like it's the perfect fit for everything that you've written about.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I just double checked. Out of all the healthcare insurance co-ops that launched with the ACA, there are now 3 left.
Yeah.
And I know that federal funding was pulled from that pretty quickly, but I mean, they had the opportunity, and I guess that the 3 still have the opportunity to kind of implement the type of vision that you've laid out on the purchaser side, and would have the financial interest to do so, insofar as kind of like an employee shareholders organization. Like, the cooperative members could see money back in terms of what is unspent over premiums every year.
Yeah. It's a great question, because I think if you look at the sort of legal structure of what I envision, a cooperative model is one of the 3 models. At least there's probably at least 3 models I could see. Cooperative is one, equity is another, maybe blockchain, maybe in California, that maybe that's what they do there. But I'm not an expert in those cooperatives, but so I'll give you some perceptions, and so others can fact check me on this. But my perspective, and the bit I know, and knowing a couple of people who've run those, and knowing folks involved with the one in Montana that still survived, that part of it was the cooperatives generally are much more of a grassroots thing. They're not sort of drop down in a community. And they're also, those were generally state-based cooperatives, which is, a lot of the state capitals are as distant to people in a given community as DC is, and they didn't really have that kind of grassroots, scrappy, bottom-up movement, which I don't think gives them as much resilience. And a lot of them, like the one that I probably know the best, and talk to people who ran it and other people in the organization, there were some constraints they had in terms of how they could market it, but they did not run as a lean startup. Let's just put it that. They spent like drunken sailors early on, and again, part of that, there were some constraints on them, but these were not lean, mean, farmer cooperative or REI co-op, or your local grocery co-op, these types of things. And so I think it's time consuming, right? I mean, it is in theory nice to be able to just drop something down, but I just don't think that works most of the time. And I think this is the kind of problem, frankly, like most great challenges in our society, whether it's, women's suffrage or civil rights or climate or better food, these are grassroots movements, right? And they are off the scene for a long period of time until there's a catalytic media moment that kind of brings them into the public consciousness. So that's kind of my perspective on it. There's actually, do I have it here? No, not in my arm's reach. There's a book I would recommend everybody read if they haven't, which is called Mutualism, that Sarah Horowitz, who actually set up the Freelancers Union, which they partnered with Iora Health once upon a time.
Yep.
And, she talks about basically they were a little mouse that was running around that got stomped by the ACA elephant. I don't think the ACA wanted to kill the Freelancers Union health plan, which was a great health plan, but they did, right? And she kind of goes into that story. And then mutualism talks about the cooperative movements, and other mutualism spans more than just cooperatives, but it's like unions and other kind of mutual aid societies. It just came out in February, I think. So definitely recommend reading that, because it kind of gets into this and how, there's regions like Mondragon, part of the Basque region in Spain, 30% of the GDP is cooperative owned. The Emilia-Romagna region, so got 4.5 million people, and in Italy, where Bologna is in that region, 30% of their economy is cooperative owned. I actually think that's I think in the jacket sleeve, I think she says, mutualism, it's not capitalism, it's not socialism, it's the future, I think is what she said. And I think she makes a good case around that.
Well, I see you smiling there. I have to wonder what's on your mind.
Larry, did you mean me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought you were going to jump in there at any second, Dr. Fine.
Well, Dave, it sounds like we need to have a beer or an Irish whiskey together. It's a little scary to hear somebody else sound like me. Or maybe I sound like you, I don't know. I wrote a book called Healthcare Revolt, which kind of lays out some of the exact same prescriptions.
Yeah.
And I'm actually working on a book on medical colonialism to sort of lay out the impact of what happens from the local community perspective, because I don't think people ever see it that way. I actually know Sarah Horowitz a little bit, or knew her years ago. Anyhow, I think the logic is clear and absolutely straightforward and completely solid. The challenge is, as I see the world, how to get from point A to point B, and how to, I don't want to say the word confront, but convert those communities and those companies that need conversion. The weight of things as they are being so intense. The logic is clear. The business model would say, well, everybody should have just, the disruption is present, let's just do it. And what's interesting is almost nobody does, despite that logic that, some of us have known for 20 years, 10 years, a while. So what's your sense of how to make this, I think it's going to take a movement, a national movement like the civil rights movement and the movement for marriage equality, and the movement for women's suffrage, and so on and so forth. And I've been quite supportive of people who are trying to build that movement. Does that make sense to you, or do you think there's a gradualist approach?
I think something that is this systemic, the only thing that has a prayer is a movement, a large scale social movement. Now, I think there's fractal elements of that. And that's where I alluded to a little bit, but in chapter 1 of the recent book, if you just read one chapter, I'd encourage you to read that. Probably the most transformative thinker that I've met that's influenced my thinking in my career, including Bill Gates, is a guy named Chris Brookfield. And he's a key architect in a system change model that I outlined there that has lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty in India and is remaking arguably the most important part of the food system in the US, wheat. Basically the subtitle of the book there, The Future of Healthcare is Local, Open, and Independent, sort of summarizes a system change model. And in the case of India and lifting the people out of poverty, that was done through microcredit, slum improvement loans, and rural hospital development. And if you look at microcredit, that's probably the one that's gotten the most international visibility. They had, at one point, the banks were threatened by that. And the banks in one state outlawed microcredit, but it was kind of too late. By that point in time, there was 400,000 borrowers, almost all women, that then could go march on the Capitol to demand it be overturned. And the other thing they did was they did a little co-option. So they did these different microcredit units did do banking with some of the big banks, so they weren't completely cut out of it. And I think it's that type of thing, where, they were literally outlawed, something. And if you look at the model I outlined there that Chris did, Chris and a bunch of others, but he was one of the key people. They were just very focused in on those micro units and how to replicate that. But it took quite a bit of time and a lot of capital. It was not without capital. They, just while he was there, they put in, I think, 700 million of equity capital and $8 billion of debt capital. When they came in, Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize for kind of popularizing microcredit, his organizations had only reached 200,000 or 300,000 people, which is better than nothing for sure, but kind of a drop in the bucket. It was their models that reached, I think it's now about 150 million people there. And so, capitalism done right, can make a difference there. And there was a good return for those. Now, it didn't fit the media narrative of, because kind of the narrative is like, white people making money on brown people must be bad, right? Even though all those organizations were, run and operated by Indians themselves, but it was indeed American capital who came in there. And it just didn't fit the narrative. So you don't hear about that story, even as remarkable as it is. Then when you bring it into healthcare, and the other way that these are things that don't make it a foregone conclusion it's going to succeed, but I think there's a chance. The other piece is that he talks about is these problems that seem intractable at a national or global level, when you bring it down to a local enough level, they actually become solvable. And then it's how do you actually massively replicate those things? And so that's where what we're seeing, this is kind of hypothesis / early observation. We'd call it the rule of threes, where in a given community, like Larry shared a piece that he wrote about one of the advisors in our program in the opposite corner of his state, Northeast Ohio. And this is kind of happening where we'll start with employers, right? We're not saying that the employer-based healthcare system is nirvana. I would argue it's one of the original sins of our healthcare system, but could be a source of redemption. And you have to deal with that reality. It is what it is. Like, even if the Democrats had super majorities, swept both houses, AOC was Speaker of the House, you couldn't wish away 157 million Americans on employer plans. You got to have a bridge out of that to something different. And so what we see in this employer space, you get 3 employers in a given locale, and this is local. I sometimes draw an analogy with the built environment. You look at what happened with LEED and how LEED took 20 years to fully mainstream around the country and fundamentally changed the built environment. Well, there was a lot going on in Portland and Austin and Boulder and Seattle 20 years ago. A lot of communities that came much later. And so getting down to that local level, you get 3, you're kind of building muscle in that community. You're starting to understand what needs to be done. You're building out the team. Nobody really notices though. You get 9, few people start noticing. As a member, you show up with this card that doesn't have this expensive national logo attached to it, and people are like, oh, we actually like this. They pay us well and they pay us promptly. And maybe you're getting your first case study or 2. Then when you get to 27, it may only be 5% of the employers in a given locale, but there's data that suggests, there's a TED Talk about this, that you only need to transform 3.5% of a community for a social movement to tip because of all the touch points. And so let's say it's 5%. Some communities, 27 employers might be 10% of the community. At that point, it's kind of game over. The CEOs that are spending 20, 40% less with much better health benefits can't keep their mouth shut. And they're talking to others. And so we see that in a place like Tyler, Texas today, where it's just rippling through the community because it's happening. And it is that grinding local work with very committed people. I'm not going to fix healthcare in Tyler, Texas. It's Rachel Means and Charlie Cano and docs and all that have to do that. So those are the things that give me hope that it can be done. It's still a monumental challenge, and there's 4 trillion reasons to protect the status quo and push back. But guess what? Civil rights, women's suffrage, climate, you name it. Like, these things all have had big pushback. But you get enough people, it can make a change.
And when they make the change, you put a little life back into democracy itself.
Yeah. So I have a question, and I honestly hadn't thought about this before this conversation, but I probably should have made the connections earlier. So the tipping point for our society to become aware of injustice has come lower over the past, I would say, over the past 5 years, even the past 2 years. And COVID really has put that in the focus and spotlight, right? So
Yeah.
the BLM movement has turbocharged the ability of people who historically have not been heard to be heard, right? And they have ally outlets like John Oliver's show and that weird effect and impact that he has of taking any topic and making it truly mainstream overnight. But do you think that we will see growing from the local level, like the same people who are protesting now about who lives and who dies when interacting with police, they can turn around and say who lives and who dies when interacting with a surgeon tomorrow, and they have a better case about that than they do on just about anything, right? Like, the conservative case for accidental deaths in healthcare now is 250,000 per year. The upper limit is 440. That's an A380 going down every single day.
Yeah.
Most of those people are not wealthy white males, right? That's so I mean, like, do you think that sense of, the negative connotation is outrage culture, but like the positive connotation would probably be this ability to say, we have the microphone, now's the time to speak. Like, can that translate into healthcare? And if so, I mean, how do you precipitate that at the local movement? How do you talk to someone?
Yeah, I think it's on the kind of negative outrage side. I think it's tougher in healthcare because there's much more confusion and complexity as to who the good actors and bad actors are. Mm-hmm. And I could, go through, I perceive as some of the bad actors, and some of them are are not perceived by any stretch of the imagination that way by the general public. And so I've really come more to the belief, in part by Chris's work in when he came back to the States, he wanted to focus on food and health. So, you know, he's an investor and a collaborator in what we're doing on the health side, but obviously food relates to health too. And the thing that I've kind of come around on is, and really understood more, is the social movements that have been successful have reset expectations. You know, from, you know, we should be a country independent of Britain, to, you know, slaves should be free, to women should have the right to vote. And so we need to set the expectation. And we look at the food movement, they did not make near the headway when they were railing about big food and big soda and big ag and all that stuff. They got much more traction when they communicated the positive attributes of this food just tastes better, it's healthier, it's better for the local farmer, it's better for the environment, da 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 da. Like that positive case did much better. And so, like if you you know, go to our site, we've got a video that goes through our tenets that spell out health. It's another acrostic. And that's our attempt at saying, here's the positive attributes of what it is we're trying to build towards. And we're, you know, I still think we haven't cracked the code in terms of how we have a message that's picked up by, you know, the average member of the public. We're getting better. But that's a big challenge, right? For something that's so complex, so fraught, and there's just a lot of confusion. You know, people think that, you know, their local hospital is an unalloyed good. I've seen some of the nastiest, most mafioso-like behavior in my career, and I've been in some pretty sharp-elbowed industries by so-called nonprofit health systems.
Tax exempt, not nonprofit.
Yeah, I just don't use nonprofit. They're tax exempt, right?
Yeah.
And so, but again, that makes it confusing. But if you take the positive case, and you look at the two examples I mentioned earlier in Florida and Alaska, like those are two of the most expensive states in the union for healthcare and hospitals and hospital pricing. 40% of the most expensive hospitals are in Florida, but they managed to spend 55% less per capita because they just kept chipping away, going upstream. And, you know, again, you can't price gouge on a surgery that never happened.
Yep.
So I'm noticing the time, and I'm wondering if there's any last questions or comments.
I have one. I have one, Dave.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. Really eye-opening, really great to kind of get the concept with the concrete. I was really taken back by something you said and love it. The replication is as important or more important than the scalability, or the scale factor.
Yeah.
Every day I work with a company full of people who are Wall Street, finance, real estate, development, and I'm the voice of primary care and value-based healthcare, and trying to kind of fashion a message in what we try to do in communities that we think need the solution that we can provide them in infrastructure to do everything great that you talked about. And it is a huge struggle to replicate a success somewhere when it's not already, the forces for good are not already there in the community. The motivation is there. You know, I can't tell you how many years I've had meetings with HR leaders of big companies who, you know, bang on the table and demand, I could tell you story after story, and demand a solution to the challenge of double-digit premium increases. And when you start to get under that, you know, they do in fact not understand what a PBM is. They don't understand that a third-party administrator listens to them instead of the other way around in that contract relationship and so forth. You have any advice for how to aggregate the so many different puzzle pieces around employer-based care and replicate the Rosen success where there's not the vision of a Mr. Rosen in the first place, you know, in a community? Any words of wisdom as we finish out?
I do think you need what Chris calls souls of fire, right? Somebody in that community is deeply invested. You know, Catherine Gottlieb, Harris Rosen. It's not them alone, but there is that leadership. We're on this journey. You know, we're getting a little smarter every day. We do an assessment. We kind of call it a community readiness for these community-owned health plans. And there's different attributes. We need to have anchor employers. We need to have anchor providers, anchor civic leaders. There's a number of different things. You know, a longer conversation. I could take you through some of that. And I'm sure there'll be some things we haven't thought about yet. But these are what we believe are necessary key ingredients to do that. And one of the things that is really important, and I tend to, needle my physician friends, is, the three most trusted professions in this country are in order: nurses, doctors, pharmacists. And doctors have a unique role to play in our healthcare system. And guess what? Well, they're employers themselves, which most of them forget. And they're getting the same cruddy health plans everybody else is getting. But they care for the business leaders. They care for the mayors, like they have a lot of influence. They're neighbors of them. They're golf buddies with them, whatever. They know them. And they're suffering in many ways. And so I think the medical culture was actually, I think I do have it here, but I've got a stack of books to get the camera in the right place. But there's a book that just came out by Robbie Pearl called Uncaring on Medical Culture that does a really nice job of that. And frankly, docs need to break out of that medical culture that's, really out of the Greek tradition of fealty to authority. And there's a logic to why you respect expertise, but they, like, if somebody is a subspecialist, like, that makes sense. But they think that the business people are also these, similarly expert, and they're not. They're actually taking them to the cleaners. And so they have to get their hands dirty and realize if they want to save their profession and save their communities, they have a unique role to play. And this untapped thing I touched on, they're all employers. And we have a situation, we have a couple of these where we're working with an independent medical group and helping them with their health plan. And then, because they have costs they're worried about and all that. But then when they can go out to the community, and the one I'm thinking about is an independent primary care group, and have this message that they've experienced it. And they said, wouldn't you like the health plan that your doctor has for herself, himself, their family, their employees? That's a powerful message. And that's one I think we could tap into more. And when they do that, like, they understand they have this dual role as an employer and as a clinical leader, and you get them exposed to some of the rot and the underneath their plans that they've been operating. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, but the contractual underpinnings of this industry, the contracting norms have normalized deviance at an extreme level. And if you get in, like a Copper State did, and you see how bad it is, you have to do a reset on that. And it's not rocket science, but it takes some work and some thought. And so but if you're in it, like I am, like, I'm in it for 20 years. Like, I have ants in my pants. I want to have stuff done today and tomorrow, but I'm also realistic. Like, this is going to take a while. And it will be up to the communities to decide, are they going to be a laggard or a leader? And so that's how I think about it. It's not an easy answer or a quick one, but I do think those souls of fire will drive it in a community and will get past the inevitable fear, uncertainty, and doubt that the status quo protectors will throw at them to freeze status quo.
Yeah, I appreciate everybody's time, but I have to ask this, Dave. After 20 years, I just wonder if you could crystallize your vision for how the Health Rosetta as a company is going to facilitate and sort of be a key part of replication of these ideas around the country.
Yeah, so I don't know how well a tech analogy will work with you, but there are some examples like, Wikipedia, or actually WordPress is a good example. WordPress is the content management system that powers like about quarter to a third of all the sites on the internet, from, little blogs to, New York Times and everything in between. They have an open source element to what they do. And so we open source, that's our 501c3. We open source this blueprint. That's where it's a little bit more like Wikipedia. Here's how to do it. We'll add to it over time. We'll ultimately open source things like contracts once they've been battle tested enough. And so that's kind of the 501c3 side of what we do. And then the public benefit corp, which we found, we didn't think we were going to have to do that, but it became clear there were gaps that nobody was filling. And in hindsight, it was kind of obvious that there would be these gaps, that to stand up a new health plan, even at an individual employer level, let alone one that's commercially available, is just way too much work today. And most people don't have the capacity to raise tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, or even an individual employer level. It's too much work. And so it's worth it, but most people aren't willing to put in that work. And so our goal is to make it dramatically easier to stand up these new health plans. It's like if the status quo plan is here in terms of its benefit, the high performance plans like we talked about, the benefits up here, but guess what? The work is also up there too. And so what we want to do is have that same benefit, but make it as easy to implement these new plans as it's easy to buy these cruddy plans, because that's the easy button. If you want to get price gouged, you don't want to have your workers see a wage gain in 20 years. You want to have the opioid crisis. You want to have the benzos crisis. That's the easy button. And that's what most people are doing today. But we're realistic, like we got to lower that barrier. And so it's a lot of work. We've lowered the barrier, but it's still harder. And so each day we try to keep it lower and lower and lower. And that's how we're trying to do it, because we don't want to be those plans. We kind of want to be sort of intel inside on those plans. We want those to be owned by local communities. We don't want to own them. That's not our goal, because we don't think that's the best outcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Comment about the conscious capitalism movement. I'm sure you're connecting up with folks. Do you see that as part of an opportunity?
Yes, I do. And I know the former chairman of the board of the Conscious Capitalism Group, and he does a lot of consulting. And for those not familiar, it's very much the idea is multiple stakeholders. It's not just shareholder uber alles. It's your employees, your community, your suppliers, like your community. And so I think that's a good, philosophically, I'm aligned with that. This is a multi-stakeholder thing. And so, we're not like officially a conscious capitalism company. I don't know if they actually have that designation, but we're very much aligned with that.
And the last thing I will say is that, so Bryce Heinbaugh from up in Ashtabula is going to be presenting in our Direct Primary Care National Summit, because he'll be able to talk about how employers, how the broker can actually help the DPC practices to communicate value to the employers in a way that the employers will understand. And the other group, the Allegheny County School District Health Consortium, I'm going to Pittsburgh next Thursday. I'm meeting with their board
Oh,
and
great.
trying to get deeper into that story. Because I think you're right. We've got these from Rosen to Nuka to, we've got these success stories. And as we accumulate these and people begin to say, hey, we could do that too, that moves from the innovator to early adopter to early majority kind of thing. So I just wanted you to know that I'm in the middle of those two.
Yeah, Bryce is it's good you're doing that. I mean, he is a good example of, I actually wrote an article back in Forbes in 2015 talking about benefits brokers and said this job could save America. The subtext was this job has kind of destroyed America, right? Because they've been putting in the plans. But the Bryce Heinbaughs of the world who've had the awakening, right? Bryce was, he was, I think I got some of this from your piece, right? He learned about my book and my TED Talk, and then he joined our program. And, he just was carrying the water for the big carriers before. But then actually he and a lot of others, these sort of 40, 50 something folks who kind of have, almost like midlife crisis, I going, oh my gosh, I thought I was doing right by my clients, but like, this is a mess. I want to do something different. And then he went all in on these type of plans. And Bryce, since he went all in, has grown, and he had a good business before, but he's grown 40 to 60% year over year in his business doing the right thing. So we're not asking people to take a vow of poverty on this. And man, Bryce is a soul of fire, right? He is fired up. He wants to make a difference in his community. He is making a difference. And he's not, flying solo on it, but he's really critical in it.
Okay. Any last comments? Great. So Dave, if you get a chance, would you send me the PowerPoints that you used?
Yep, definitely.
Great. And I'll get this rendered tomorrow or the next day, and we'll get it out to the rest of the group. Dave, once again, thank you very much. You're doing awesome work, and keep it up.
Okay, thanks. Well, I hope you all go make it happen in your communities.
And the next time you're in Rhode Island or near Boston, give me a ring and I'll buy you that beer. And I don't drink
that
beer.
Sounds like a good plan. And I'm fully vaccinated, so we can, high five, handshake, whatever,
Cool.
Michael, just make sure it's not a beer and a shot at the same time, right?
Well, he did specify Irish whiskey, so it could very well be that.
Yeah.
Well,
that was my first thought.
Boston Boilermakers.
Yeah.
There you go.
Hey, take care, all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Larry.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Larry.
All right. Bye-bye.
Welcome.